parks and Marvel. So the question has come up, and I did a little Twitter thread about it a while ago, of what's the deal with, Disney owns Marvel, and yet when you go to the theme park, certainly the one in Florida, you see very little evidence of Marvel there. There's little sprinkles of it here and there. They are building a Guardians of the Galaxy ride in Epcot, but in general, there's very little. And if you go to California, you see a lot more, both in the California Adventure and in the normal Disneyland theme park. And of course, Hong Kong Disney has an Iron Man ride. And so you're seeing more Marvel other places. You're not seeing as much of Marvel in Tokyo Disney, but that's yet another part to this story. So, yet you go up the street to Universal Studios and you see there's a whole Marvel Islands of Adventure and a bunch of Marvel content. But at the same time, the Marvel content feels extremely dated. It's X-Men in their '90s costumes. It's actually, if you're into nostalgia, you miss the '90s. Universal Studios is kind of nice. You go there and it's like, oh wow, this was Marvel Comics of the '90s, from the costumes to the characters to a lot of the art. Some nice Ron Lim art is actually super large up on the wall. And a bunch of other good creators. Lim's the one that always stands out for me there. But anyway, so what's the deal? Well, this, like many things, it's a legal situation. It's a contractual situation. So back in the '90s, before Disney bought Marvel, Marvel was in, let's say, some dire straits. They weren't in the best position. This is post a bunch of the image creators leaving, and the Heroes World debacle was kind of rolling through the company, and Marvel, frankly, needed cash. They needed money. And so they signed an agreement with Universal that was profoundly weird and reflected some of the general sensitivities at the time and what people were interested in. When people sign contracts, they go for what they think they can benefit from. Well, this contract was extremely in Universal's favor, that gave them rights to use the characters, gave Marvel pretty much zero creative control over how those characters would be used and the rides that would be done and everything else. Completely, night and day difference from how current properties, Avatar and Harry Potter, are handled today. But it gave Universal a lot of control, a lot of rights. But the weirdest thing about the contract, at least for me, is the territory. So basically, keep in mind this is the '90s, not 1890s. The contract specified that Universal had the rights to these characters east of the Mississippi, and I'm not making that up. It's literally it's kind of the east side of the country, but the Mississippi was our dividing line, which is, I don't know. I mean, maybe I always find that just very funny. I find that a very strange contractual term, but okay. So the so Universal kind of this left the West Coast, LA and other things, free for Marvel to sign another agreement. Universal Studios, of course, existed there, but it wasn't the same park at the time. In the '90s, Universal Studios in LA had a few rides. Was more designed for movie making. It was more like the backstage tour. If you've been to Hollywood Studios, it's more like that was kind of the theme. Yes, there were rides, but it was more geared toward movie making. Whereas Universal Studios in Florida was really being built up as just as rides, as full on Disney World competitor. So I think there was a couple things at play there. Marvel wanted to hold out in hopes that they could double dip on the contract if Universal did expand their park in LA, which would be difficult based on the location and property and other things. But if they did decide to do that, they'd be able to go back and get kind of another contract. They were also holding out hope that Disney might go in at some point on them, or Six Flags or one of the other theme park companies. There were some early talks with Six Flags that were going on at the time, even though there were DC properties there. But at any rate, they wanted to carve out. And then the other part of it was, Marvel still fancied itself at the time as an entertainment company. This is a vision that would actually carry them into the next decade, and in a lot of the moves that they made. But anyway, that's why they did kind of what they did. Universal, meanwhile, get the rights to these characters, build some rides. The Hulk coaster that was kind of new and very popular at the time. It's a good roller coaster where you lose the change out of your pockets. That's kind of what it's most known for. Doctor Doom drop. There's a Spider-Man ride, And there's a shop in there with a ton of comics. And what's funny is that shop today has a ton of comics and graphic novels and comic merchandise, far more than what you get at Disney Springs, where you have an actual shop there. Well, Disney does buy Marvel, and now things get complicated. Disney, of course, knew about the contract, but and the first goal was to kind of have Marvel be an entertainment and licensed property. So on the surface, Disney's actually kind of happy, and they think they're being very clever because now they're basically getting revenue from their competitor. Universal's paying license fees and merchandise fees from their park. And so that's Disney is now profiting off of their competitor. It's just something Disney always. I mean, there's some like an angel gets their wings at Disney every time they can pull off one of those, and they do that from time to time. But as Marvel gets more popular, and I think simultaneously as Star Wars struggles out the gate is not the right word to use when Force Awakens is making all the money it's making. But in terms of integrating Star Wars into the parks, there's some easy things to do. Stormtrooper, they had Star Tours there already. Kind of the next lift of what you do with Star Wars turned out to be a bit more complex than they thought, and some of this is due to kind of Imagineers at Disney feuding with some of some traditional Star Wars, some LucasArts people, and just some general arguments caused that to kind of tinker along. And meanwhile, Marvel, which has a lot more properties and in many cases feels like more that they could do in a theme park setting. Just Marvel's as a property, there's a lot more diverse rides, and word diversity always comes up, but there's a lot more you can do with Marvel in the park was the thinking at the time than Star Wars. Star Wars is rooted in science fiction and other things. It doesn't integrate as well. Whereas Marvel, you could see it sprinkled into everywhere, all the parks. You could have a Savage Land kind of thing. You could have Wakanda show up in the Animal Kingdom. You could have, that's not a racist comment. That's just by nature. There was actually a lot of thoughts about putting it there before the contract kind of reared its head again. I'll get to that in a second. Over at Epcot, the mission space could be translated to Guardians, and inside the World Showcase, you had a lot of opportunities to feature some of the different nationality heroes, and just why not have Captain Britain over there in the UK and Alpha Flight over in Canada? I mean, there's just you can kind of imagine there's a lot you can do with the auxiliary parks. In Hollywood Studios, there's all kinds of things you can do. You can put Iron Man over there, and you can preserve kind of the Magic Kingdom for being the traditional Magic Kingdom that it always has been. It's just there's a lot you can do. However, this contract existed, so suddenly the contract is starting to become a bit of a nuisance. And the trick, though, is as Marvel's brand is rising, it's in Universal's best interest to keep it too. So now all of a sudden, if you'd gone back in time 5 years, Disney probably could have bought the contract out of Universal, possibly on the cheap, or at least cheaper. But now nobody wants to move. Disney kind of wants the rights. So then now they start playing with the contract because the contract listed a bunch of existing characters, very similar to the Fox deal that Marvel also signed prior to Disney, that gave the rights to the X-Men and the Fantastic Four and kind of this odd carving up of characters. Similar things happen. So things like Guardians of the Galaxy, Ant-Man, as I mentioned, Black Panther, suddenly become a get more complex. Who owns the rights to Black Panther? Can we put Black Panther in the park? Well, the answer, of course, is on the West Coast, no problem. We do Black Panther signings. You have the character showing up there. But on the East Coast, it's determined that no, actually, it may fit into kind of the Avengers, this other agreement. And then there's the problem of just Marvel as a brand entirely. So this now you start to look at the contract and you discover a couple more things. The contract specified theme park usage, which means you could, in theory, put a Marvel branded hotel in Disney World, no problem, because it's not in the theme park. It's a hotel. And this is why kind of at peak kind of craziness, if you went to Disney World during a lot of the movies, they would put vinyl skins on the monorail to promote movies, to promote Iron Man and the Avengers and other things. They'd put that on there. But they couldn't put it on the monorail that would actually go into the park because they didn't want to confuse the people with that this was a park ride. It was the monorail that would go between the hotels and do the general kind of ferrying of people, but it couldn't. So there was this odd, we can't have Marvel as a brand showing up in the park. And then the question is, is Disney Springs, or what used to be downtown Disney, technically the park? And so you had initially the Marvel store and plans for the Marvel store there. And then they have to remove that and change the name to Superhero Headquarters and not have the Marvel brand there. But you could sell Marvel merchandise inside the store as long as you didn't prominently feature the logo. This is the complete, if your head is spinning right now, this is the world of lawyers and contracts. But anyway, this is a messy entanglement that they find themselves in. So it is determined at some point that Guardians of the Galaxy is definitely not covered in this Universal agreement. And so we move forward with putting the ride there. And there is zero doubt at all that Disney's lawyers and Universal lawyers are talking to figure out a way around and out of this that could benefit both parties. Universal, meanwhile, is moving forward with a third, or depending on your point of view, fourth park, because they have Universal Studios Orlando, and then they have the Islands of Adventure Park that's right next to it. Then they have the Volcano Bay Water Park, and then a new park kind of away from all those, sort of near the convention center and kind of near the airport, is in progress. And that park is looking to be a similar clone to Disneyland in terms of you kind of walk in on a main street and you have the big center area and then a bunch of lands around it. And what seems really true, at least from what people are guessing, and as you're looking at the construction, is that Nintendo is going to play a pretty massive role, and probably even just possible some other Japanese properties like Yokai, although that hasn't really taken over in the U.S. But definitely Nintendo is going to be a big part of the future, as well as more Harry Potter. And so you see Universal, they're preparing for a new future without Marvel. And the Marvel rides and the Marvel part of Islands Adventure have definitely in need of repair. The rides are a little bit antiquated, but the branding and the paint and everything else is very old. It's, as mentioned, it's old costumes, and so they're in need of updating those. But Universal is also a little bit trapped because they're not sure they can update the costumes and the characters and any of that stuff either, contractually based on what Disney owns. So it's kind of this weird trapped in amber agreement, but fascinating situation. It definitely, so in terms of plugs, I would say if you are into 90s nostalgia, you miss that kind of era of Marvel, then you've got to get to Universal Studios in Florida soon so you can kind of live. I mean, you just walk around, it will transport you back. In fact, that whole area, which has kind of newspaper funnies, and that's going to go any minute now. I think it might have already actually started to be taken away, but you have a very kind of classic feel for a while there, which is a nice kind of nostalgic feeling. Oh, I was going to mention, okay, Japan. So really quickly, what's going on in Japan? Well, a lot of people don't know this, but Tokyo Disney is easily one of the most profitable, and at times has been the most profitable Disney park. If you ever go to Japan, you go to Tokyo Disney, and you think you know lines. You do not know lines, Jon Snow. It is an insane amount of crowd that packs into that park. Weirdly enough, no stereotypes here, but the lines move along faster and more orderly. So even though you have these, much higher capacity of people going in and out, you get a lot more efficiency with people coming in and out of the rides, and the whole park operates better. Go figure. It's like polite, sensible people know how to handle themselves. Who knew? But anyway, that park is interesting because what a lot of people don't realize is that that park is technically owned by a company called OLC, Oriental Land Company. And if you're here in the West and you're kind of squirming at that name, there's a lot of things that use the Oriental word in Japan in company names and other things. They don't seem that fussed about it. Not nearly as much as we here in the West seem to get irritated by that term. Go figure. Japan seems to roll with it no problem. But there you go. There's a lesson in there somewhere. But anyway, so OLC owns this park, or they maintain it, they operate it. There's definitely a licensing agreement, so Disney gets lots of money. But OLC also has a remarkable amount of control over what they can do in the park. And if you go to Japan and you go to Disney, they very meticulously create the Disney experience. And there they have Tokyo Disney, which is somewhat of a clone of Disneyland, and they have Disney Sea. And you'll notice a lot of touches in those parks, particularly in Disney Sea, that are just over the top, kind of detailed, really amazing level of quality. And they'll do things like on certain anniversary days they'll hand out pins for free. And they have a there's it's if you want the ultimate Disney experience, that's the place you go, which is ironic since it's not owned by Disney. But anyway, part of that arrangement with OLC also prevents them from doing some things. It's one of the reasons why Marvel hasn't swept in there as much. But if you want the most best over the top, if you're a Disney fan, like a real big Disney fan, and you have not gone to Tokyo Disney, that is the pinnacle. That's where all the best merchandise is. That's where the ride experiences are in many cases the best. That's where you can go on Splash Mountain and get a lot of Song of the South that has been completely erased in all the other parks. Not I mean Briar Rabbit, and Briar Fox, and all that are still at Splash Mountain, but the connection. They finally, I think they removed it, but you could go into Tokyo Disney and you can go into a little merchandise store next to Splash Mountain and you can get a bunch of like Uncle Remus stuff. I mean, it's like, oh wow, okay, somebody didn't get the memo over here. But anyway, crazy times. So there's a little bit of history. If you've ever wondered about that, there you go. That's my little theme park history lesson of the day. Thanks for listening, and I hope that you've subscribed. If you haven't, please subscribe, like, click the bell for notification, follow me on social media at Comic Perch. Tell a friend. Would love to have more of you around, and thanks again.